ever feel like development, like the word itself gets tossed around
Yeah.
without really like digging into what it means?
I know what you mean.
We all know it's supposed to be good,
Right.
right? But good for whom? You know? You sent over these textbook excerpts on development, and honestly, I think we need to unpack this whole idea
We do.
because it gets complicated fast.
It really does. What I find fascinating is how often it's reduced to just numbers,
Oh, totally.
like a pure numbers game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bigger GDP equals it, boom, automatic success.
Yeah.
But your excerpts, they get at this, it's way more nuanced than that.
Right, because it's not just about like the bottom line. Exactly. It's like thinking back after World War II, right? There was this huge push for countries to develop,
Huge push, yeah.
especially former colonies. It's like finding their own way. And it seems like reading this textbook, they paint a pretty optimistic picture of that era.
It was a time of, a lot of hope, for sure.
Almost like a one-size-fits-all approach to development.
There was definitely a sense of, like, this is the model.
Okay.
Take India, for example.
Okay.
Newly independent. They were striving to emulate that Western-style industrialization.
Right.
Believing it would, rapidly improve living standards for everyone.
Yeah, makes sense.
It was the era of those big, ambitious projects,
Yeah.
like the Buckranangle Dam, this symbol of progress.
Right, right.
Massive, massive undertaking, like reshaping the landscape.
Wow.
And the textbook points to India's 5-year plans as a prime example of this approach.
Okay, so they had a plan, literally.
Literally a plan.
But those big projects, I mean, as impressive as they sound,
Oh, they were impressive.
they must have had some serious ripple effects, right? I mean, you can't just reshape a landscape without someone feeling it.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where, the picture gets a bit more complicated, yeah.
Yeah.
The plans, they were laser focused on things like industrial output, infrastructure, modernizing agriculture. The hope was that economic growth would just kind of eventually benefit everyone.
Right, like a trickle-down effect.
Exactly. But that's where things get complicated.
Yeah.
Because that narrow focus on just economic growth
Yeah.
often came with a hefty price tag.
Meaning?
Social and environmental costs that weren't always, let's say, factored in.
So, kind of a progress at all costs mentality. Were there any alarm bells ringing back then?
It's interesting. The excerpts, they do mention the displacement of communities,
Okay.
often the most vulnerable ones,
Yeah.
to make way for these large-scale projects.
Right, makes sense.
Dams, mines, industrial zones, they all need space.
Of course.
And often, it was the already marginalized communities who paid the price, losing their homes, their livelihoods, even, their cultural identity.
It's like building a shiny new airport, but displacing the very people who are supposed to benefit from it.
That's a good way to put it.
And the textbook mentioned the Narmada Bachao Andolan movement, right?
Yes, the Narmada movement. Powerful example.
That resistance against the Sardar Dam project. People literally putting their lives on the line to protect their land and their way of life.
It really brought that human cost of development into sharp focus.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about, like, economic progress anymore.
Right?
It was about people's lives, their deep connection to their land, their very identity. It forced everyone to confront the question, development for whom and at what cost?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the social consequence.
Right, because you can't just like dam a river or build a factory and not expect there to be
Exactly.
some kind of environmental impact, right? It's like what the textbook mentioned about deforestation in the Amazon, like wiping out these vital ecosystems, for like short-term economic gain.
Right.
But that's a cost that future generations are going to have to bear.
It's a classic case of what they call intergenerational justice.
Right.
It's like, do we have the right to just use up all the resources today
Right, exactly.
that future generations might desperately need?
Yeah.
It's a question that, it hangs over a lot of these development projects, even today.
Totally. And it's not even just about the future, right? It's about the people living in those communities, like right now,
Right.
relying on those forests for their livelihoods. They're the ones feeling the impact right now.
Yeah. It's like,
Like the textbook gave the example of the 2004 tsunami,
oh, yeah.
where the destruction was even worse in areas where they had cleared the mangroves for development.
The mangroves, right?
Yeah.
They act as a natural barrier, but because of that short-term thinking,
Right.
That protection was removed. And then when the tsunami hit,
Right.
it was that much more devastating for those coastal communities.
Wow.
It really highlights that need to think long-term.
Totally.
Not just the immediate economic gains, but the long-term consequences socially and environmentally.
Okay, so then if we can't just rely on economic indicators like
Yeah.
GDP to measure development, then what's the alternative? Because we need some way to measure progress.
Yeah, yeah. We need a more holistic view, I think.
Yeah.
And the textbook, it points to the Human Development Index,
Oh,
or HDI,
the HDI. Okay.
as a good starting point.
Okay, so break down the HDI for me. Like, how's that different than just looking at how much money a country has?
Okay, so imagine like two countries.
Okay.
Same GDP,
Yeah.
but in one country, people are living long, healthy lives. Their kids are getting a good education.
Okay.
The other country, life expectancy is way lower. A lot of kids aren't even finishing primary school.
So even though they have the same GDP, like on paper,
Yeah.
the quality of life for everyday people is drastically different.
And that's what the HDI captures,
Right.
right? It goes beyond just the economic output and says, okay, but how long are people living?
Right.
What's their education level? What's their access to healthcare?
Mhm.
You know, it's about like measuring progress in terms of human well-being, not just how much stuff a country's producing.
It's a much more nuanced way of looking at it because, like you're saying, it's about whether people are actually benefiting from this development.
Exactly.
Because what's the point of like a high GDP if it's not actually translating into a better quality of life for ordinary people?
Completely agree.
And that actually reminds me of something else the text mentioned, which is this whole idea of rights.
Ah, yes.
So, like, what kind of rights are we talking about in the context of development?
Well, it's about moving away from this idea that people are just like passive recipients of development,
Okay.
that somehow progress will just like trickle down to them.
Right.
It's about recognizing that, no, people have a right to actually be consulted
Okay.
in the decisions that directly affect their lives,
Yeah.
to have a say in how resources are used, how projects are implemented.
So more of a bottom-up approach.
Exactly.
Like giving communities a seat at the table.
The seat at the table, that's a great way to put it. And this is where this concept of right claims comes in. The textbook specifically talks about 3 types of claims.
Right.
The right to be consulted, which we just talked about.
Right.
The right to livelihood protection, and the right to resources.
Okay, let's unpack those a bit. So we talked about the right to be consulted, but what about this livelihood protection? What does that mean?
So this is particularly important when we're thinking about like traditional livelihoods, often tied to the land or to natural resources.
Right.
So imagine a government comes in, wants to do some big development project,
Right.
maybe a large dam or a mining operation.
Okay.
What happens to the fishing communities that are downstream?
Right.
Or the indigenous groups who depend on that forest that's being cleared?
Right. It's like it's recognizing that development, quote unquote,
Yeah.
can have these unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
That sometimes progress for some can actually mean hardship for others.
100%. And that's where that right to livelihood protection comes in.
Okay.
It's about saying, okay, hold on. How do we make sure that people's basic needs, their means of survival,
Right.
aren't sacrificed in the name of development?
So it's not just about giving people a voice.
Right.
It's about protecting their ability to provide for themselves.
Yes.
Even as things change around them.
Exactly, even as things change around them. And then you have the third right claim, which is this right to resources.
Okay.
And this one gets really, really complex.
How so?
Because it forces us to confront some really fundamental questions about ownership and control.
Like what?
Like, who owns natural resources? Is it the state? Is it corporations? Or is it the communities who have depended on them for generations? You
Well,
know?
it's like that classic saying, water is life.
Exactly.
You can't talk about development without acknowledging that access to essential resources, like water, is fundamental.
It's fundamental. And that's where the textbook draws this direct link between development and democracy.
Right.
Because you have all of these, competing claims, these complex questions about, okay, well, whose rights are we prioritizing? Whose needs? And it requires a framework for negotiation, for participation, for accountability. And that's where democracy comes in.
So it's not just about, like, the physical stuff, the dams and the factories.
Yeah, it's bigger than that.
It's about building fair and inclusive societies.
Building fair and inclusive societies. That's a great way to put it.
That feels like a good place to kind of pause for a second.
Okay.
Take a breath, let everybody kind of catch up.
Yeah.
Because we're going deep on this idea of development today, looking beyond those kind of like simple definitions and really grappling with some big, big questions.
Big questions.
And we'll be back in a moment to talk about, like, okay, so what are the solutions here?
Right, right.
And what does this actually mean for the future? Okay, so we've talked about, like, this need for a more holistic view of what development even means.
Right.
One that takes into account the social, environmental, even, like, the democratic factors at play.
It's a bigger picture.
It is, but it also sounds kind of theoretical, you know? Like, what does that actually look like? Are there, like, real-world examples of this more nuanced approach to development actually working?
Absolutely. And this is where I think things get really exciting.
Okay.
The textbook does touch on some practical examples, like rainwater harvesting, promoting solar energy,
Right.
supporting local food systems.
Okay, yeah.
But it's bigger than just individual projects, right?
Right, because, I mean, swapping a diesel generator for solar panels, that's great.
It's a step.
But it doesn't address those bigger systemic issues we've been talking about.
Exactly. It's about, like, shifting our whole mindset
Oh, yeah.
from how do we develop to how do we thrive.
Ooh, I like that.
It's about recognizing that true progress, like real progress, requires a fundamental shift in values.
Okay. Like what?
Moving away from this constant need for consumption, for more.
Right.
Towards a more balanced, sustainable way of life.
Okay, that's a big ask, though, right? I mean, we're so conditioned almost from birth to think that more stuff equals a better life. So how do we even begin to change that? That feels so deeply ingrained.
It starts with just questioning our assumptions.
Okay.
Like, what if, instead of constantly striving for more, we focused on, like, making the most of what we have?
Okay.
What if we lived in a world where things like access to education, healthcare, green spaces, a strong social safety net
Right.
were considered just as important as GDP growth?
It's like that saying, the best things in life are free.
Exactly.
Except in this case, maybe not exactly free.
Right.
But it's about investing in things that genuinely enhance our well-being.
Yes. Quality of life over just, the size of your wallet.
Exactly.
And the textbook is really clear about this. Democracy is crucial to achieving this.
Okay.
It's about creating spaces where people can talk, where citizens can participate, where we hold our leaders accountable for making decisions that actually prioritize, the common good.
So it sounds like it also requires a shift in power dynamics, moving away from that top-down decision-making.
Yes.
To something way more collaborative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Recognizing that the people closest to the problems are often the ones who are best equipped to find the solutions.
Totally.
So imagine, a community comes together and they decide, no, we're going to protect this local forest instead of letting it be cleared for some mining operation.
Right.
Or a city that prioritizes, public transportation and bike lanes instead of just building more highways.
So it's less about imposing development and more about giving communities the power to shape their own futures.
Empowerment. That's the key word. And that's where I think this idea of lifestyle changes comes in.
Okay.
Because ultimately, right, real change requires us to rethink our own consumption patterns, be more mindful of our impact, not just on the planet, but on each other.
Yeah, it's that thing of, it's about individual responsibility and systemic change, right?
Absolutely.
We can all make conscious choices.
Yeah.
But we need governments and we need corporations to step up and create the conditions for a more sustainable future.
It has to be collective action.
Right.
Citizens demanding change, policymakers actually enacting it, businesses innovating new ways of doing things. It's complex.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also an incredible opportunity.
Because at the end of the day, it's about building a world where development isn't just about economic growth. It's about human flourishing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A world where everyone can thrive.
Yeah.
And that's a future worth fighting for.
Wow, that was a journey. We started with some basic textbook definitions of development and ended up questioning the very idea of progress itself.
It's deeper than you think.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's clear that this whole concept of development, it's way more complex and nuanced than we often give it credit for.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And you've given us a lot to think about today. This whole conversation, it reminds me of that quote from the textbook. They said, true development should enhance our freedoms, not limit them.
That's a good one.
Right. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. If true development aims to improve the quality of life for everyone, could our current definition of progress actually be holding us back?